Hello and welcome everyone. Today I'm joined by Sarah Vaughan. I think most of my viewers know you, Sarah, but please maybe introduce yourself a little bit.
Sure, it's nice to be with you, Tigray. I'm a social scientist, political scientist. I was for many years associated with the University of Edinburgh, but I'm a freelance consultant and I've worked on the politics of Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa since the late 1980s.
Yeah, and indeed, you have written a lot about Ethiopia. Maybe I think your latest book is something that many of our listeners and viewers would have read, Understanding Ethiopia's Tigray War. It was and we did an interview about that actually, maybe about a year ago. A very, very useful, authoritative book on the war. Gives people analysis and context about the war. And they have since also been writing articles. And this conversation is going to be based on an article that I found really, really relevant, Sarah, where you describe um, politics by other means in Ethiopia today. And we're going to talk about that. And you talk about these terms that we bandy around when we talk about Ethiopian politics, terms like insurgency, counterinsurgency, and stuff like that. And you say that the Ethiopian context doesn't quite neatly fit into those descriptions. So maybe we could begin with the basics. What is an insurgency? What is a counterinsurgency? And why is it that the Ethiopian context doesn't quite neatly fit into those descriptions?
Sure. No, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about this article. It came out in July, I think, in a journal called Small Wars and Insurgencies. And it was something I was asked to write by the editors of a special collection. And it pushed me to read the literature on insurgency and counterinsurgency, and see how things were changing in terms of the concepts and how they could be applied, or whether they could be applied to Ethiopia. And what really struck me was the way in which this is a context which actually doesn't really feel like counterinsurgency the way we've understood it in the past. I mean, the two sets of things. First of all, there's the kind of conceptual normativity about insurgency and counterinsurgency. So there's this idea that there is a kind of stable state and government regime which is facing a challenge. So you have the kind of stable government and you have the unstable, violent insurgents. So counterinsurgency in that thinking is about restoring stability. In the Ethiopian context, it would be the restoration of Mungust, this idea of government, but which also includes notions of stability, authority, discipline, order, coherence, cohesion, and so on. So it's a positive thing to be counterinsurgent. The insurgents are problematic, violent, unstable, and the counterinsurgent force, the state, is generally benevolent, beneficent. So this is one set of, it's very deeply rooted in the idea of counterinsurgency. But there's also a debate which has gone on amongst scholars in the last few years, and this is something this special issue was wrestling with, about whether or not how it is that counterinsurgency is most successful. And traditionally, during the Cold War period, for instance, there was this idea in the international literature that basically counterinsurgency was not just positive in terms of the end, the restoring of order, but in terms of the means, that this was about winning hearts and minds. It was about, treating a population well. Use of force, yes, but basically, delivering services, delivering the promise of democracy, self-rules, these kinds of things. And that was kind of somehow inherent, this ideological normativity, if you like, certainly in the US attitudes to the way they were doing counterinsurgency in different contexts. After Afghanistan, I think in the last 10 years, that really shifted. And there was a really important new book came out written by a woman called Louise Hazelton, which is called Bullets, Not Ballots. And she's basically saying it's not the kind of winning hearts and minds which works. It's force and the threat of the use of force, so whether you actually use force or whether you threaten to use force against a population, plus a really effective series of alliances. So if you can get those two things to work, then your counterinsurgency will be successful. So in the paper, I was trying to look at whether or not this could be applied to the Ethiopian case. Do we see the use of force and the threat of force? I think, and I document in 3 different cases, the Oromia theatre, if you like, which began fairly soon after Abiy came to power at the end of 2018. Already we had some very serious violence in the Walegas. And then, of course, the Tigray war over 2 years, and more recently, since mid-2023, this campaign against the Amharas. So there are all sorts of different problems with this. And one of the first problems I see is that actually this is not a government under Prime Minister Abiy that looks like it's trying to restore stability or trying to, establish, stabilize, deliver an effective state for all of Ethiopia's citizens. It looks much more, and here I'm quoting from some ideas which are put forward in Tom Gardner's book, The Abiy Project, that, this feels like an insurgent prime minister. It's very dynamic, it's very volatile. There's a lot of jumping from one thing to the next. You remember that period in 2018, 2019, when everybody was just trying to catch up with what was going on. It was very, very, high moving. And then when it moved into these periods of violence, it was also extremely destructive and it almost looks like deliberately destructive. So one of the things I trace in the paper is the way the central government almost went out of its way to precipitate these 3 insurgencies. And I also discuss why I don't think they are really insurgencies. There are lots of problems with calling them insurgencies. But in the Oromo case, really, it was almost impossible to imagine that some of these returning OLF fighters, which then formed different groups with the OLA, could possibly accept the deal that they were being offered. In a sense, it didn't really feel like they were supposed to accept it. It was a way, the amnesty in 2018 got everybody back into Ethiopia, but then also, went to war all over again with them. So first with the Oromos, secondly with the TPLF, TDF, and thirdly with the Amhara Fano, so-called militias. So you brought these forces in, and initially, you leverage Oromo nationalism to come to power in the first place, with the support of a kind of incipient Amhara nationalism, which was quite new in 2016, 17, 18. So those are the forces that brought Abiy to power. But then, having obtained power in April 2018, he began to sort of, I've called the Oromo chapter of this paper, pulling up the drawbridge, sort of stopping the Oromo nationalism, which had been used to leverage power, from then coming to threaten him. So there's a discussion about the way in which Oromo nationalism was divided and demobilized effectively, with great violence and great manipulation. Then it's a very short account of the Tigray situation, but I've explored that in more detail in the book, how, whatever the faults of the TPLF, and undoubtedly they were not as smart as they might have been at the time, but nevertheless there was really no chance that they could escape being attacked, just because they represented too much of a challenge to the centralization of power going on under the new Prime Minister. And then, of course, we have the third act, which is the Amhara, who formed part of the coalition, which had been mobilized against the Tigrayans, then turning against Abiy in the wake of Koha. And that also, there are elements of how that happened which look as if it was, it was almost something that the federal government wanted to initiate, this very, very heavy-handed, sudden decision that they were going to demobilize the regional special forces in Amhara. This was obviously never going to succeed. I think we remember the state minister of peace, himself an Amhara, who said, after a few months, 70-80% of them seem to, or more than 50% of them seem to have joined Fano. This was a fantastic recruiting mechanism for the Fano militia. So, it almost looks like a deliberate strategy to create insurgents against whom you can then mobilize. So lots of different issues and lots of different reasons why it really doesn't look like the classic stable government trying to overcome forces of instability. But there was one other thing which really struck me as important. It took me a long time to write this paper, because we have got into a habit of talking about the Tigray war separately from the rest of what's going on in Ethiopia. And there are good reasons for that. I mean, the violence that was inflicted on the population in Tigray was egregious and exceptional. And I still think before this history is over, there will be a full investigation and it will be found to have been a genocide. And that may take a very long time. But, so in a sense, the Tigray case is exceptional. But it's also only one act in a much wider drama. So I think it seemed to me really important to look over the three instances, and there may be more to come, who knows, of this kind of process of waging war. So it seemed to me important to see the Tigray war as an element in a wider Ethiopian civil war. Part of the reason for doing that was to try to restore the kind of analysis of the politics and the agency and the intention behind some of these steps. Because I think when we fall into the trap of treating Ethiopia's terrible violence as a series of discrete conflicts, the Tigray conflict, the Oromo conflict, the Amhara conflict, Afar, Somali, whatever it is, we run the risk, one, of belittling what is extremely serious and pervasive violence, but we also kind of edit out the politics. I was recently talking to some diplomats, and there's almost a tendency to describe these terrible conflicts that Ethiopia is afflicted by as almost like a sort of wildfire. It's something that happens to the government. It happens to the regime. The poor prime minister and his cabinet are kind of beset by these irrational forces. I wanted really to step back from that and say, actually, no, they are a really important instigator and creator of the kind of tensions and the kind of problems which people are reacting to in these different cases, and that they share many, many common features. I don't know if that is a very long-winded answer to your question.
But it's excellent because it's excellent because you have now outlined the broad picture. Also, I think people could now have a sense of what the paper is about. I'm going to add a link to it so people could go, and I think it's behind a paywall, but people will find a way to get access to it. But you say that it has taken you a lot of time to write the paper, and I see that. As I was reading the paper, I could see that there's a lot of nuance, a lot of care and definition of terms and everything. So I could see that, and you read that, and then you kind of the kind of descriptions and language that was being used by the international community, you immediately realize how mistaken and how shallow it was. For instance, the TPLF was routinely described as a rebel force, and the Abiy regime are trying to rein in on a rebel force. That was the conventional understanding among the international community during the Tigray war. And you read your article and you realize how wrong that was. Maybe we'll come back to the Tigray issue, Sarah. The subtitle of the article is counterinsurgency or dissolution of the state. And you now mentioned that the prime minister himself is an insurgent prime minister. And I wonder if that is by, and I think you alluded to it, that it is by design, that he is an insurgent prime minister, that maybe he stands to lose if he was trying to bring order to the country. Maybe people would demand for, I don't know, economic development and other things. If it is by design, I don't know if that is your contention. what is the end game then?
Well, we shouldn't get too far into speculation, and I mean, I think I'm really just trying to document the evidence of what is visible and what is known so far, and to trace some of the things that look like patterns there. So I wouldn't want to speculate too much about what the end game is, but I mean, we certainly see commonalities of a kind of centralization of power and a securitization of power. I mean, I think it's really important to say this isn't new. It didn't start in 2018. I'm one of those who tended to see the EPRDF period, or at least the middle period under Prime Minister Meles, as a relatively positive period for Ethiopia. But there were some very negative elements of that picture, whilst there was a lot of pro-poor change and growth, very positive movements, even at a global comparative level, on Millennium Development Goals and so on and so forth. There was a very, very brutal counterinsurgency in the Somali region after the attack on the oil installation at Awale. So, there has been a sort of securitized approach to that I would call insurgency. That was a kind of stable center that wanted to quash a regional force that wanted more autonomy, that actually pushed initially in 1994 to move to secession, to implement Article 39, and the central government crushed that. And then again you had this resurgence of the Somali insurgency in 2007, 2008, with the collaboration by then of Eritrea and some other regional forces in the context of the Islamic Courts Union and so on and so forth. So it's a complicated story, but I think it's really important to see that some of the institutions which have now been incredibly important under the Abiy period have their roots in counterinsurgency that was conducted during the EPRDF period. In particular, I'm thinking of the regional special forces. The first regional special force was the Somali Special Force, which was established in the context of the campaign against the ONLF. So this idea that it wasn't good optics, basically, for the Ethiopian, predominantly Highland Christian National Defense Force to be going into southern Somalia or the Somali region against Somali Muslim antagonists, and that it was much better if it was Somali forces who were involved in this activity. So that's when this regional special forces thing started. I think I've strayed quite a long way from your question. You'll have to remind me where you wanted me to be going.
What my question? I mean, you didn't want to. You said that you don't want to be led into speculation. But my question was if there is an element of design into the.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. It's very easy. A lot of people have underestimated.
But just to give you more context, the reason I ask you that, Sarah, is because now, and I told you this before we started recording, there is a sense among Ethiopians that this is now a fact of life. The instability, the fact that there is civil war in Oromia, in Tigray, in Amhara, and you say that this is politics by other means, which seems to me that then that means that it is by design.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, it's hard to avoid that conclusion. I mean, I think one has to look at the patterns which have become entrenched, and say that whoever is taking decisions at the center knows what is eventuating from these so-called counterinsurgency campaigns, and sees the utter devastation of large tracts of the country. We're not talking about Tigray. Okay, it has been recategorized as a relatively peripheral area. It's a relatively small population. It's heartbreaking what's been done, but one could say, well, it's far. But I mean, the fighting that's going on in Oromia and Amhara is not far. These are kind of, it is large areas of Ethiopia which are now, really fractured and suffering grotesquely in terms of the demolition of service delivery and the state structures which had been built up over so many years. You do have this kind of schizophrenic situation in Ethiopia. There are some parts of the country which are absolutely booming. You've got Hawassa, Arba Minch, some of these towns in the south where there's massive population growth. Also, people moving back from Addis Ababa to places like Arba Minch. I mentioned the massacre of Gamo elders in Burayu as something which many Oromo observers have attributed to government manipulation back in 2018. But one of the effects of those killings in Burayu has been to push migrants who had been based in Addis Ababa back to Arba Minch and Chencha and those areas. So the combination of corridor development in Addis, which has disenfranchised some groups, but also this kind of inter-ethnic tensions which have been exacerbated in the period since 2018, has really changed the landscape. But nevertheless, some parts of the country are doing okay, and certain parts of the political elite are lining their pockets. That's absolutely clear. But there are very, very large parts of the country beyond the Addis Ababa bubble, if you like, which are really in very great distress. And that's going to take generations to recover from, even with the best will in the world. And I'm not sure we do have the best will in the world. So to go back to your question, what's the objective of all of this? I mean, it begins to look as though keeping these kind of powerful, effective, influential parts of the country at bay, weakened, divided, distressed, under brute force, is a strategy to keep them away from the political debate and the political competition, which is really what's needed. I mean, the other issue which I point to in the paper is a tendency to see Ethiopia's conflicts as, well, it's normal. There are an awful lot of outsiders who say, well, yeah, Ethiopia's been fighting forever. I mean, look at this border between Ethiopia and Eritrea. It's never been at peace. What are we supposed to do? It's in the DNA. I really reject that. I mean, I think that's actually quite racist as a way of looking at, nobody is captured by their history. Any country can transcend its history, can break out of whatever patterns have been there. And can turn itself around. So for me, we should really be looking at what are the political drivers of this, because this is political conflict. It's not, atavistic ethnic hatreds. Insofar as there is ethnic suspicion between different groups, that's been confected, that's been whipped up, that's been manufactured deliberately by elites, in my view, and it could be otherwise. So what we really need to be looking at is the activities of elite politicians and the decisions of politicians who could have taken different decisions and could still take different decisions. I mean, I think it's not a coincidence that we're having this conversation in a week where there's very great anxiety about the situation now between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and the way in which Tigray may or may not be being caught in the middle of these two very belligerent actors in Asmara and in Addis Ababa. Perhaps we can also talk about that a little bit, but I think it is in the interests of Addis Ababa to see, certainly if you look at Tigray and Amhara in some ways rather differently, but these are parts of the country which had a really sophisticated political capital, a lot of solidarity, a lot of social solidarity, an effective movement of social change in rural areas, and demobilizing that, and in particular demobilizing the shared political capital, has been the way of removing a very serious potential threat. So I think we're back to a really kind of negative zero-sum way of conceiving of the way Ethiopia could be. That it's very zero-sum. It's, ironically, absolutely the opposite of the narrative and the rhetoric which is used. This is really about dividing people and keeping people apart and keeping people mistrustful of one another. And as a result, an awful lot of people need to be kept down. The same could be said about the Amhara elites, for instance. I mean, there was, it's known historically, populations from Amhara or speaking Amharic tended to be more educated, more dominant in positions in business or in politics at the center of the country. Also, some Oromo groups who were involved in the expansion of the country in the 19th century. These are historical facts. So, when you start to feel like you're threatened by particular groups who may not be loyal to the center, then marginalizing them and undermining their home areas and taking a very violent response or threatening violence towards their independent action is a good way of keeping them out of the political space. So, absolutely the opposite of what the National Dialogue Commission, for instance, purports to be doing. So we have this kind of theatrical performance of transitional justice, accountability, national dialogue, elections, God help us next year. But also, the reality is very, very different.
So, okay, so we have this performance from the regime, this shifting thing, and it seems to be working. And maybe we'll come to Tigray. That definitely you say in the paper that it's working in Tigray. But another reason why I found your paper very, very relevant is because it also challenges the assumptions of the international community. Because one of the assumptions they have when working with regimes in Africa and in Ethiopia is that the governments are trying to impose law and order, and that there is a centralized government so that they could invest or whatever it is that they are looking after. But that is not happening in Ethiopia. And they don't, the Americans, the Europeans, for instance, they don't seem to be particularly interested in, for instance, following up with the Pretoria Agreement, or whether the Ethiopian government was having control of the Amhara regime, of the Tigray regime. They seem to be happy with the fact that there is a degree of equilibrium. But one wonders why are they happy or content with the current arrangement? So we understand from the Ethiopian regime's point of view, it works. It could stay in power maybe by pitting one group against another. But why are the members of the international community happy with that arrangement?
I think this is a really interesting question. I mean, I find the attitude of those in the international community I talk to absolutely horrifying. We are in a much more brutal period in international terms. I mean, that's clear. It's not only in Ethiopia where politics has become much, much more instrumental and much, much more transactional. I think, this goes in line with the Americans and the British and others just cutting the amount of money that they're sending in aid or humanitarian support, and cutting their engagement and their interest in the rest of the world. It's also a context in which Ethiopia is competing with Ukraine, with Palestine, even Sudan, which is in the most horrendous mess. You would think this week this would be what's happened in Al Fasher and continues to unfold in Al Fasher would be a real wake-up call for people to think hard about what may also be getting worse and about to get very seriously worse in the Ethiopian context, this prospect of war between Ethiopia and Eritrea. But I sense a real kind of sense of complacency, and it's either, we don't know what to do about it, it's too complicated, but a real kind of shift away from a more ethical positioning, which even in 2020, I noticed just this last week with the 5th anniversary of the outbreak of the war in Tigray, a number of people have been retweeting the message of Commissioner Borrell, the External Affairs Commissioner of the European Union. There is no equivalent of that kind of ethical, relatively principled concern. And even within the EU hierarchy, that that position, I think there's been a rewriting of history. People looking at the position taken by Borrell, saying, "Look, we need to do something about this. We can't countenance this. We have to suspend development cooperation, for instance." That was very contested within the EU. There are an awful lot of people sitting in Addis Ababa who were not happy, and in Brussels as well, who were not happy to take any action against the Ethiopian government, which, considering what was going on at the time in Tigray, is absolutely horrifying. You take also the case of the UN Commission on Human Rights experts in Ethiopia, and the unwillingness of the Human Rights Council in Geneva to continue the mandate of that institution, whose commissioners were effectively begging for more time to finish the job because they knew there was more work to be done. So I think there's really very, very little interest in ruffling feathers. It's hard work to go on trying to hold a government that is quite elbows out, let's be clear, to account. There's also business to be done. We've just seen last week the Ethio-European Investment Forum taking place in Paris. The government in Addis seems to have sent a very, very high-level delegation, both the Foreign Minister and the Minister of Finance, so they obviously need the cash. Whether or not European investors really have the stomach to be investing in a country which is seeing so much carnage, I don't know. But it's a very, very cynical situation, and I find it very also surprising, I think, because if Europeans in particular don't, under current circumstances where the sovereignty of Ukraine is being compromised, the sovereignty of Denmark has been called into question over Greenland, for instance. It's surprising to me not to see European politicians and diplomats taking issues of sovereignty and incursions of sovereignty. I'm thinking now of the issue of Assab and Eritrean sovereignty much, much more seriously. One may not like the Eritrean government, but that's rather different from a breach of international law, which would constrain its sovereignty in any way. Sorry, I'm wandering on to things which are not discussed in the paper. But perhaps we should talk a little bit about Tigray also. I mean, I do think, and I'm not alone in this, a number of analysts who look at this really closely really do blame the federal government for a systematic, step-by-step, deliberate process of unravelling the political elite in Tigray, in a sense, continuing the war by other means after Koha. So, you had this extremely problematic, complicated and opaque and ambiguous deal, which was only that, a cessation of hostilities agreement. And thank goodness, I mean, those of us who remember that awful 10 weeks of fighting in 2022, thank goodness they managed at least to stop that. But the terms of what was agreed are so unclear and, so much contested. One wonders what happens next, especially now, with the Prime Minister standing in Parliament last week and saying that, well, the Koha was basically signed not with an organization, which of course is not legally registered in Ethiopia, but with 3 people who now support him. What does that mean? I mean, one would think that the international community might respond rather sharply to that. But of course, I think, Tigrayans are perhaps sometimes a little naive or over-optimistic about the extent to which the international community is invested in Koha or cares what happens. Also, I think it's really important to say that the major narrative, which is dominant, is the narrative from Addis Ababa, which says that it is the TPLF being difficult, being belligerent, being elbows out in the last few days, moving into Afar, threatening these 6 villages with heavy weaponry, which they're not supposed to have. They're supposed to demobilize it. That is the narrative which is being poured into the ears of diplomats on day in, day out. And I don't hear any alternative narrative really coming very coherently from Tigray. I understand the psychology of the post-Koha trauma in Tigray. I mean, what was done to Tigray in those 2 years was excruciating. And I think, this sort of arguing, scrapping that first year when the leadership sat in meetings arguing about goodness knows what they were arguing about, was partly, I think, driven by shame. I remember somebody at the time asking me, why are they sitting in meetings like this? And I think that, this kind of sense of recrimination for the loss of something really very precious and very hard fought. We know how, Tigray nationalism was birthed in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, how brutal that process was, how this was a community and a part of the country which really felt it had come out of its history and left it behind. And then to have this incredibly humiliating defeat. Let's be clear about it. The TPLF was defeated. They signed Koha because they had no choice militarily. But I think that's also important to say that the federal government didn't have much choice either. They weren't under military pressure, but they were under acute economic pressure at the end of 2022. So these are two parties which sort of signed under huge pressure. And it's good that they did. But it was the beginning of the process, not the end. And it has never been followed through. And I think, I hear my Tigrayan friends when they say, look, there's never been any interest in taking this process forward, in doing the political dialogue, which was a core part of it, in, moving to the return of IDPs and so on. But also one has to say, that politics is the art of the possible. And when you've been defeated, you have to work with what's there. And I think seeing this terrible division amongst not only the Tigrayan leadership, but I was last in Tigray in February, and seeing that division that went right down into the society was really devastating. So that is a very, very serious damage. One wishes that the new generation would just get on and start a different politics, start something which is going to be more cooperative, more collaborative. But old habits die hard. It's very difficult to see where that goes now. And the loss of trust. I mean, I also put a lot of blame on those who have allied with the federal government. It's one thing to say we shouldn't be belligerent, we should be more accommodating, we should work with Abiy. It's another thing to be encouraging the federal government to go to war with Tigray and encouraging a narrative whereby Tigray is responsible and should be attacked again, which effectively seems to be what some actors are doing. That, it seems to me, is unforgivable. So where are we headed? I mean, there's a lot that's been written recently about Tigray being the trigger for another round of fighting, for another war. That feels to me like a bit of a manufactured excuse. I mean, I don't think that this is 2020 all over again, because Tigray doesn't have the capability, the capacity, the agency that it did then. I don't think Tigray threatens the centre in the way that it did, I don't think it threatened it in 2020, but I don't think it has the capability now, or the agency now. And I think that this is, again, it's a confected narrative from Addis Ababa to say that, look, Tigray is allying with the Eritreans, Tigray is doing this, Tigray is smuggling gold, Tigray is, involved in human trafficking. These people are awful, they never change. That, it seems to me, is a confected narrative, an exaggerated narrative. Not to say that there aren't some bad actors, which is going to be used as an excuse for moving not only against Tigray, but also against Eritrea. And that, I think, is probably where we're headed next. I hope I'm wrong. I've spent an awful lot of the last decade hoping that I'm wrong, and so far I haven't been. So,
well, this confected narrative you mentioned, Sarah, is interesting because in one of the papers that you cited, I was reading this brutalization thing where regimes threaten people and then people have no option but to submit. And one wonders if that is what is happening in Tigray, because intellectually everybody knows that the Abiy regime has always wanted war and that it has tried to create excuse and all that. But now, when the Ethiopian government accuses the TPLF of being provocative, of plotting, and all that, it has a degree of traction among Tigrayans. Tigrayans accept that narrative because they really, really don't want to go to war. And I think they find it easier to accept the narrative from Addis Ababa and to blame it on the TPLF, even though maybe on deep reflection, they know that that is not what is happening. I don't know if that is something that you would like to reflect on, but I would also, if you could dwell on the Tigray issue, Sarah, you write in the paper I think with a degree of regret and maybe lamentation as well, that the TPLF leadership has allowed itself to be used by Abiy in the way that you just described, and I think many Tigrayans ask why. Why is it that they with it seems with a degree of zeal went into the trap set up for them, which is how the divide has happened.
That I think is really difficult, and I'm far from these events, and I don't follow them with the closeness that which would be needed. And I think also we need to be a bit careful. I mean, I've ventured into what may happen next, but I normally try to focus on what we do know, and you often need to let a little bit of time pass before the truth comes out. I think there is really a lack of strategic thinking. I think this is not surprising in a leadership which has been really traumatized by what's been done to the people of Tigray, what they have agreed to with Koha, and also a sense that they couldn't quite believe the appalling terms on which they're supposed to operate. I mean, I do understand why people who have spent their lives committed to establishing this system of federalism, self-determination, degree of autonomy, a certain amount of respect for one another's politics, are now being subjected to this incredibly humiliating, incredibly problematic games, for instance. But I mean, I think a little bit more care going into the process of the election registration thing, I think would have made more sense. But I also think people should have read Tigray's history much more carefully, because it was obvious what was going to come. I think ever since early 2023, anyone who read what happened to the Tigrayan elites in the period when the Italians invaded Ethiopia and this kind of division that was sown would have known that that was a risk. Anyone who thought about what had happened in 2001 when the TPLF split, I mean, Tigray is a relatively small region. Its unity is one of the only things it has. And to see not only the sort of divisions between individuals in the elite, but the resurgence of this kind of Aurajawinet, which one had thought had been put to bed, is absolutely horrifying. So I think there's been a lack of reality, a lack of realism. Perhaps, I mean, I also think, the leadership in Tigray has been perhaps, sort of isolated in Tigray and not looking at the bigger picture, not looking at the wider picture of the way things were going in Ethiopia, in the region, and so on and so forth. So it's really difficult to know, but I think there are all sorts of reasons why this kind of division could have resulted. But, I mean, it is also not new. I remember having conversations with Gabor Asrat, for instance, in the wake of the 2001 division. and saying, why on earth are you trying to set up a new political organization? Why don't you write an honest biography of what you've been through so that the new generation can learn from what you think were your mistakes? But don't try and come back again. Leave it for another generation to emerge. And I think, I'm reminded of conversations when I was first doing research on the emergence of TPLF in the 1990s, and talking to people who had been young men when they set up the TPLF, and talking to them about their frustration with the EDU and this old feudal class. And it struck me when I was in Tigray this year that they are now this old class which needs to get out of the road and let the new generation start to move in. Because Tigray has something very, very special politically. Wodebna is something really profound in the DNA of the rural population. And I think we need not to overestimate the sort of irritation of Tigrayans with the TPLF. Yes, there are some people in urban areas who would very much like a different political system, maybe want a more neoliberal political arrangement which suits their business interests. But there are many, many people in rural areas who do want the organization, our organization, to come back and pay attention to them. Perhaps if there's one central mistake, I think, which I found really surprising visiting Tigray after the war, was this sense of a leadership which was no longer quite so closely in contact with the rural majority. And, visiting some of the sites of terrible atrocities, but not finding the kind of organizational attention to those communities, other than from the Genocide Commission, which I think has been doing spectacular work. But really not feeling that the regional government and the leadership, wrapped up with meetings and arguments and discussions in Mekelle, was paying enough attention to the needs of those communities, which are still suffering from so much. Perhaps let me touch on one issue which I feel extremely uncomfortable about, which is this IDP issue. There's an awful lot of talk in Addis Ababa that the TPLF is using the IDPs as a pawn and, doesn't want them to go back to Western Tigray. Because then they will lose their bargaining chip. That I really object to. I don't think that is the right way to think about the IDP issue. The IDPs can't go back to Western Tigray under current circumstances because they wouldn't be safe. That's quite clear. We've had a number of academic colleagues who've written and published really, detailed and devastating accounts of the situation of Tigrayans in Western Tigray under current circumstances. The expulsion of Tigrayans, Tigrinya speakers from Western Tigray has continued in the last 3 years since Koha. So, to be treating the IDP issue like, as if it's some kind of political pawn, that I don't agree. I think that is something which is coming from Addis Ababa. It suits the Addis Ababa narrative. Maybe some of those Tigrayans who are now collaborating with Abiy. But that's not really the case. There is a genuine, serious crisis and problem with how those people can have their livelihoods and their land restored. And that can only be resolved, I think, now by a serious political dialogue. It has to have a serious commitment from all sides to make that happen. And if I have to identify a primary actor who is ensuring that that doesn't happen, it's the federal prime minister. It's not the TPLF. I think they would like nothing better than to see those people go back to their lives and livelihoods. But it's quite clear that, Western Tigray is a strategic piece of land. It lies at the nexus between Eritrea and Sudan and Tigray and Amhara. And the last thing that the federal government wants is to have peace restored. So we're back to the pattern that we started discussing earlier in the conversation about the advantages to the center of this instability and violence and distrust.
Well, I think it's really good that you spoke powerfully about the IDP, Sarah, because there are outrageous lies being told about them. And um, what is really sad is that these lies are being parroted even by Tigrans, as you say, whether
Yeah.
it's knowingly or unknowingly. I can't say, but it's sad spectacle that Tigran should join in the lie. So it's good that you spoke very powerfully about that. I mean, the idea that you should ask people to return to people who, even now, are threatening that they would kill them. Even now, I mean, if it's not that they have shown any degree of remorse or regret or have taken accountability or anything of that sort. They are very, very open um, about their intention, very, very genocidal sometimes. And to tell people that they should return, I think it's very, very dangerous. Um, but you say that people should read Tigrayan history. I think that's a good point. And maybe I should say that you do provide a very condensed summary of Tigrayan history in your book that you have written with Martin Plaut, Understanding Ethiopia's Tigray War. So maybe I would invite people to read that. Of course, there are a lot of other books on Tigrayan history. But maybe one final point, Sarah, we're kind of running out of time. There is real fear and worry among Tigrayans now that there could be war in Tigray, and this time among Tigrayans themselves, because there are now Abiy-aligned militants based in Afar. They are threatening to, as they say, to free Tigray from the grip of the TPLF. And the TPLF has taken a very, very entrenched position, as you would expect the TPLF and the TDF. And people don't know what to expect. And maybe if you could help us make sense of what is happening, and if you have some recommendations and, I don't know, piece of advice to grants, I think that would be wonderful.
Look, I think it's really the best thing that Tigrayans can do is to lobby consistently for against war, against armed confrontation, and to lobby their leaders to back down. I mean, I feel absolutely horrified by the activities of this Tigray peace force, so-called. I mean, a more ironic name would be hard to think of. Um, and some of the reactions that they've elicited in Afar speak for themselves. I mean, this hideous events in Barahale, when the Afar population really blocked them from moving through that area around Punaba, for instance, just north of Barahale, up into Tigray. And then you had a real retaliation against the population of Kunaba from the Afar regional government, and an awful lot of Afars who crossed the border into Eritrea. So, in a sense, the presence of TPF in the Afar region is exacerbating the risks of a wider confrontation with Eritrea. And again, one has to wonder whether this isn't part of the rationale. But also what we've seen this week, this very provocative move when the regional president, Tadesse Warada, was visiting Churchill to go on maneuvers in the south, which is now, again, it's drawn in the TDF to move into this zone 2 of Afar, presumably as it was supposed to do. I mean, this really does look like a trap. It looks like a way of, I don't know what the Tigrayan leadership now, military or civilian, is supposed to do. I mean, this is the rhetoric coming from the ENDF, coming from the Prime Minister, coming from those Tigrayans who are now working with the federal government is horrifying. So, yeah, I don't know what's ahead, but it doesn't feel good. And honestly speaking, I think we really do need to shift the frame back onto saying, look, this is now a contest between Abiy and Isaias. And, the most important thing that the TDF leaders did right up until, at least until January, February this year, was to say, we will not get involved in any of these other struggles. No, we will not get involved with Afar. No, we don't want to get involved with any other project of the federal government. That was a principled position, and they, really must try to retain this. But I don't know. I think maybe we've gone beyond that point now, and I'm not optimistic, I'm afraid. I think things are going to get an awful lot worse before they get better at some point.
Mm. I mean, we haven't had time to talk about Isaias, but again, the fear among Tigrayans is that the TPLF might foolishly decide to align with Isaias, and of course, Isaias would want to fuel a war between Tigray and Addis Ababa. That would be his dream scenario, and yeah,
I mean,
yes.
let me just say one point on that, maybe in conclusion. But I mean, I gave an interview a few weeks ago in which a number of people said, "Oh, you're making a false equivalence between TPLF allying with Eritrea and some Tigrayans allying with Abiy." No, I don't think that's right. I think what is being done by those Tigrayans who are allied with Abiy, establishing this Tigray peace force, making these very belligerent noises. That is clear and documented and evidenced, and it must be condemned. It's outrageous. What is being alleged to be taking place between the Tigrayans and the Eritreans is much less clear. And I think, anybody who looks at this honestly and says, where's the evidence? It does feel like there's no smoke without fire. And I very much wish that, before the war started in 2020, there were a number of very belligerent speeches that came from the leadership. Debretzion's speech on the Katits before the war started, for instance, was incredibly elbows out. That didn't work. It doesn't stop people attacking you, just sounding very, aggressive, or we'll do this, we'll do that. That doesn't work. It's not going to work this time either. And it's doing damage because it's feeding a narrative put by other people that, you are going to be prepared to be working with Ethiopia's enemies. And I have to say also from a personal point of view, it is stomach turning, the idea of Tigray politicians, leaders working with a government which so recently sent its soldiers to massacre in very systematic and deliberate ways, to rape in massive numbers. It is not acceptable to be working either with Abiy's forces or with the Eritrean forces in this kind of collaborative way. So it really is stomach turning, I think. However, having said that, the TPLF does deny. It's hard to say that there's very clear evidence of what they're doing. But I do think that they need to be much, much more politically astute and work with the political situation as it is, not as they would like it to be. The only thing that the Tigray people and those who care about them need is peace. Peace and space in which to recover. That hasn't yet started. One thing which my paper is saying is that regardless of the cessation of hostilities agreement, the Ethiopian civil war hasn't stopped since the end of 2018. It's morphed. I've called it a shape-shifting war. It's continuing to morph, and it will continue, not resolved until the federal government and the regional governments who have responsibility for their populations start treating them better, because otherwise I don't see how this can be resolved. We talk an awful lot about conspiracy, the Eritrean hand which was involved in the fighting in Wollo in the last few weeks and months. What about the fact that the people of Wollo have been treated appallingly badly? Of course, young men in Wollo have flocked to support the Fano against the ENDF because of the way they've been treated, because of the drone attacks, because of the closure of schools and clinics, the slaughter that they've seen. So let's talk about the way Ethiopian citizens are being treated and how to resolve that, not about just this conspiracies and things that we may or may not be happening, but we don't yet have very clear evidence for.
Well, Sarah, you say that it is stomach turning that Tigrayan officials are now working with the Abiy regime. It's more than that, actually. They are now going to great pains to say that Abiy and his regime was on the right side of history, kind of. They are flirting with that idea. So the lie and the revisionism is extraordinary. And you wonder why. Why are they doing that? I mean, the reason why I'm asking you about Eritrea and not that is because I think that is kind of open to everybody. Everybody could see what is happening, what they are doing with Abiy. One excuse they say is that they have the Pretoria Agreement, and the reason why they are working with Abiy is because the Pretoria Agreement dictated that they work with Abiy. But of course, that is a lie. It's more than what the agreement says, what they are doing. But I think the worry among Tigrayans is that yes, Abiy wants war. Yes, what the people working with Abiy are doing is very clear. We can see that. But what might bring war to Tigray is if the TPLF were to align with Isaias. That would be the really bad thing for the TPLF to do. I think that's the reason why I asked you that and not the other aspect. But I don't know if there is some final concluding remark you'd like to say, Sarah. Otherwise, that from me.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is a really demoralizing conversation, but I don't see how it could have been anything else. I mean, this is an incredibly demoralizing and incredibly worrying situation. And I would perhaps in conclusion just appeal to those in the international community or who have contact with the international community to, we must do everything we can to prevent the situation spiraling into another war, because it will be really horrendous again. And nobody needs that. The region can't stand it. Tigray can't stand it. The world can't stand another war. It's too much already. And I think, we really also need to be very realistic about the resources which were available to try to alleviate the situation between 2020 and 2022. They will not be there again. We don't have UN offices in Tigray anymore. Most of them have been closed. We don't have an international community which is involved in humanitarian aid flows at anything like the scale which was necessary. And this is really worrying, not only for Tigray, but also for parts of Amhara, Wollo, and North Gondar, and so on. There just isn't the interest or the institutions that there were even 5 years ago. So, if this is allowed to start again, heaven only knows where it will end.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. And I should say that I really like reading your books and the articles, even for someone like me who observes Ethiopian politics and Tigrayan politics and who foolishly think that I understand everything. When I read your books and your articles, there is always a degree of sophistication and a degree of analysis that I hadn't understood. So I really appreciate your writings, and it's always a joy to speak with you here as well. And I hope you're going to make time to come on again in the future. As you say, it's a very demoralizing conversation, and I think we could see that things are going to happen. So we want you to come on and teach us really about what is happening. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Teklai. We're all students, and there's so much more to learn. But thanks for your kind words, and it's been a great pleasure to join you.